Good afternoon, everyone. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you all to our first noontime lecture of this spring semester. Lydia Kalipoliti has been coordinating the larger lecture series, but within it we've placed a series of lectures that I hope you will be confronted with and entangled in other ways. And today with it, two young architects whose focus on housing in Switzerland has introduced an entirely new perspective on this building type, something that is completely alien to common practices. We've had past dialogues with other Swiss architects, and I remind you that none of them would have been possible were it not for the generous support of the Consulate General of Switzerland in New York. Thus, before I launch into the introduction, I'd like to first thank Elena Benninger, who served as the senior project manager for the Swiss consulate in these past years, and whose enthusiastic outreach to us has allowed for the type of program we're about to sponsor today. And then alongside her, I want to introduce Aita Pult, the new head of the Department of Culture for the Swiss consulate, who we would have met in person were it not for the pandemic. So before we get started, it's my pleasure to hand over the virtual mic to Aita for a few introductory words. Aita?
Thank you, Nader. We are delighted to collaborate with you and are particularly proud to once again be part of this student lecture series at Cooper Union and to bring contemporary Swiss architects to the next generation of young architects. Collaborations such as these are particularly important to us because we believe that architecture, sustainability, and innovation are best shared beyond borders. And this is really the role of the consulate here, to make a link and create an exchange between America and Switzerland on various topics. So therefore, it is my pleasure to support this presentation of young Swiss architect Scheidegger Keller and to bring some Swissness to New York City. Back to you, Nader.
Thanks so much, Aita. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to New York again, virtually as it may be, but I do hope that we'll gather together in person soon hereafter. Shifting our eyes back onto today's guests, Christian Scheidegger and Jürg Keller, theirs is a practice that has been emerging for almost 2 decades, and with it, a paired interest that is not only professionally grounded in its delivery of exemplary buildings, but a practice with deeply held pedagogical convictions, something that will become central to their contributions to Cooper Union this semester. Today's lecture is merely an introduction of a body of work under the title of Society of Rooms, but their participation in our community will be extended for a series of workshops for our 3rd-year housing studio, team taught by Nima Javidi, Daisy Ames, Mokene Makeka, and Mercia Veladar. After their talk today, I'll be joined by Nima to co-moderate the discussion and advance a series of questions to our guests. We'll also ask the audience to post their questions in the chat box, and Nima can tap into those along the way, ensuring that unanswered questions may also find their way back into the studio. I was introduced to Scheidegger Keller's work not so long ago, and with only a few minutes of review, captivated by a consistency of operations that span a wider variety of projects, both civic and residential. While for this occasion, I will primarily focus on their housing projects, it is important to underline that their civic work also casts a theoretical shadow on the residential, in part because of how they handle the tensions between bottom-up and top-down thinking. From the bottom up, their configurational studies emerge from a meticulous interest in the molecular scale of rooms, rituals, and the individual body. These aggregations of systems, modules, and bundles commonly evade the classical grid, but even more scandalously, they refuse adherence to the overall volume of their buildings, or sometimes they merely reshape them. From the top down, their interest in the iconic, the generic, the recognizable, or even the geologic maintains a fidelity to formal and gestural traditions that condition our legibility of the built landscape, whether as signifiers entangled with historical referentiality or symbols elusively tied to the mountainous terrain of the Swiss Alps. But most importantly, my interest in their work stems from the disjunction between the figurative and configurative modalities within their working process. To be clear, I don't actually know how they work, and this is merely a conjecture. So today I will listen alongside you to determine how the misalliance between interior geographies and exterior urban encasements coalesce. Like all exemplary practices, the work shows evidence of certain experiments stubbornly adhered to time and time again, tested to their ultimate yield point. Their particular investment in the plan as a medium is sufficiently anachronistic, and yet it yields inventive typologies that force us to live differently. Here, architecture is not merely a backdrop, as their work might suggest from an iconographic point of view, but deeply instrumental in how it obliges our bodies to interface our environment in different ways. Consider the consistency of their work on plans. All of these plans are formed around a common core. Sometimes it's a service, sometimes it's social, but from which an organization unleashes in a centrifugal fashion. In turn, the expression of each building is dictated by different forms of constraints, corsets of varied exposure, if you permit, some of which contain the configurative rapture of these plans concealed entirely within, such as in the Mehrfamilienhäuser, excuse the pronunciation, other times entirely exposed as a seductive figure, such as in the Altersiedlungen, Helen Keller, and other times ambiguously orchestrated in a mediated embrace, such as the Gartensiedlungen in Froberg, where the concurrent presence of an exterior figure holds together the interior organs of a plan unhinged. Yes, these are three entirely different buildings, but they display one intellectual project being tested out against varied principles that commonly not only define but compromise housing. The first revolving around the domestic setting, the social institution of the family and its redefinition, and the second, the interface between the building and its political setting, an urban landscape, whether gauged against the artifice of the city or the geographic landscape beyond. Of course, the relationship between the inside and outside of buildings has been a topic of many historical debates, with a facade as an alibi to conceal, a picture plane to reveal, or a mask to insinuate. The ethics behind each of these vary, with certain ideological underpinnings in evidence, some architectures conceding to taxidermic indifference, while others to a religious reciprocity between the interior and the exterior. In the work of Scheidegger Keller, these two realms are forced onto each other in a wrestle that is muscular in its display. There is little natural or automated in this exploration, and to borrow from Robert Levitt's texts, it is deeply arbitrary in the best way it can be articulated because it is authored not so much as an image, but rather as a grammar that precedes the calligraphic imprint of how they make us live. There is much more in the work of Scheidegger Keller to be enumerated, but I will let them elaborate on their own terms. Suffice it to say that once every blue moon, one discovers a body of work that challenges, teases, and refuses easy categorization. Such is the case here, and one's inability to consume it with facility is part of its richness and central to its intellectual delight. So with that, allow me to welcome Christian and Jürg into our virtual presence. Take it over.
Thank you very much for the introduction of our work. We will see what you think after the lecture about it. I think we just start. So we will focus this lecture primarily on housing project we did over the last decade. We started to deal with housing after finishing the Leutschenbach school and the house with one wall in Christian Kerez studio, because we wanted to explore architectural topics we didn't know so far. The picture you see, I see the mess here, sorry. Give me a second. So now it works. Fine. The picture you see are installations first year students did during a semester. We thought that the ETH, it was in spring 2011, and their task was to build a space within their own apartment for a specific use by reducing the size to a minimum and studying the spatial quality of very small rooms. The installation show a few spatial aspects about housing we like to think about. For example, housing compared to other programs has usually very small measurements. The rooms are small compared, for example, with a school or an office building. The maximum size of rooms in housing is the living room, eating and cooking area. In Switzerland, it's around 40 square meter. The chamber is around 14 square meter, and the bathroom is around 4 square meter. The interesting thing about small rooms is that when you walk around in an apartment, the distance from one room to another room is quite short. So when you walk around in an apartment, the direction change quick, the light change quick, the view also change quick, and the spatial sequence is quite intense. For example, compared to a museum where you walk quite a long way from one room to another room. The other thing, what is quite fascinating on housing is that housing has a lot of rooms. Let's say when you're drawing a housing competition, it always takes the longest. Many rooms, many walls, many elements, and all of them are quite small. So housing is quite a dense plan. So you deal with a lot of rooms. And these rooms are, we think, they are actually quite free depending on the shape they have. For example, get back to a school, the perfect proportion of a classroom in Switzerland for around 28 students is 7.2 meters by 10 meters. Should be a rectangle shape, should be orientated east-west, so no one gets shadow during writing. But in housing, the shape of a room is quite free as long as you can put the furniture there. And I think these examples you see, you see there are small rooms with 2.8 square meters for a working space, 7.8 square meter for a living space with a triangular floor, and even a chimney or a really small sleeping room. So the shape of a room, even the size, is quite flexible depending on the design. And we all live in apartment and a house, and we are familiar with the common size and proportions of the rooms and the elements. And I think what makes quite a strong impact when you can kind of switch them into or shifting them into a certain direction, stretch them to a minimum or a maximum to get the more intense spatial quality, that something can get really small and on the other side it can also become huge. Maybe some last thoughts about housing in general is also, let's say, when you build housing, also the construction from interior rooms are quite open. Maybe there are many conventions you have to deal, but not so many orders and laws, and conventions you can kind of overrule, what gives you a certain freedom at the end to construct it. One main issue is always, for example, the acoustics. What is, I think, a huge problem, for example, in school buildings, because the ceiling is just soft and not hard anymore. And in housing, I think, depending on surfaces, on the way you construct also interiors is actually quite open. And then, last but not least, housing is actually the mass of our cities. It forms the public space, the street, squares, and parks, and not as an outstanding object, but as an entity. So housing, I think, has a certain responsibility because we build so much of it, and so it's on us to kind of create an urban public space. We have chosen some projects. Some of them are built. Some are just simply concepts. We start with Houses as Chamber and Path. It's a competition we won in 2012. It was our first competition. It's located in Bern. It's the capital city of Switzerland. The client is the city itself. And how you see the area is very beautiful. Most houses are freestanding, 1 or 2 family houses with a garden. They have the pitch roofs. They're from the 20s. And on the last plot, we just placed 2 additional freestanding buildings, also with a hipped roof like this one. And there are like 3 houses, 3 apartments. We have one on the ground floor, one in the middle, and one under the roof. And the difficult question was when you have a hipped roof, the groins here, the space becomes very low. So instead of having the top apartment had 3 storage rooms, we just added the room always to the apartment below. The last one is the staircase. So each apartment has part of the roof. What you see here, this is the view up to the roof. So you get like I say like a vertical space and with a kind of weird ceiling, even you're on the ground floor. And this vertical space kind of breaks then this horizontal organization of an apartment by a certain generosity. And when you look at the picture here, you're not sure if the door is too small or the 3-story space just simply too high. The other aspect we liked on this setting is that we could deal with a freestanding building. Normally, for example, when you do bigger blocks, you always have two facades for designing an apartment. And here we suddenly have like 4 facades for one apartment. So one apartment per floor. And mostly you organize it in a field-like structure with, let me see, sorry. In a field-like structure with 9 rooms, and one of them is a hall. And these 9 rooms, there are 12 possible connections. You see 1, 2, 3, all of them are 12. When you change the geometry of the hall, suddenly you get like 16 connections. And when you start to introduce a space, you get 20. And the interesting thing is that suddenly you can connect this space with this space here. And from the hall, you can also enter the corner room. So we started to think about to connect spaces. How can we connect spaces? How can you walk around in an apartment? So here you see the organism of this house and this floor, and the rectangular shapes is always like maintaining a service room. For example, this one here is the kitchen. This one here is the folding bath from Leuk Congress. This one here is an entrance. And this one is another bathroom, and they have simply rectangular shape because the equipment is also rectangular. And the position of these switching rooms, we call them, they defined the whole organism, because one side of each rectangular is like fixed. So what you get is like a quadrangle with sides who are given, let's call them A, B, C, and D, and an angle, what is like you need to define the quadrangle. This one is alpha, we call it. And then it's also the question of the position or the rotation of the quadrangle inside the square. So about this rotation, what is beta? So because all walls, they always go like perpendicular to the facade. So what was interesting for us to understand this geometry of the apartment is that we can write a program to simulate all possibilities of constellations of rooms. So you see that what is changing is just alpha and beta, and you see always the size of each room. You see the length of each wall. It's an information you need because for furnituring. You also see the amount of stairs. What has to be correct, otherwise you cannot connect one floor with the other one. So we just like calculate it through a certain time. And we have to say that actually an intern of us was writing this program with GeoGebra in one night. So some rooms getting really narrow. It's a little bit difficult to live in there. So that's what we have chosen. This is the apartment at the Zwyssigstrasse number 14 in the first floor. And it's important because all rooms or all apartments are different in this house or in these two houses. It has to do because the constellation of the switching rooms is not always the same. On the other house, the folding bath and the kitchen are opposite each other. And what you see now in this, it's quite a dense organism with a lot of rooms. The apartment is 130 square meters, and the client asked for 5.5 room apartments. And instead of like merging functions like living, eating, cooking, together, we start to separate them, that each room has a known function to get as many rooms as possible. So when we count, for example, this apartment has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rooms and 4 switching rooms. And even this plan is quite dense, because it's like a typical chamber plan, we call it in German. And there's a certain generosity because you can connect, how you connect the rooms with each other. For example, let's say when I come home from the stair, I can go through the entree, I go inside the hall, go inside the kitchen, grab a beer, drink my beer, watch some TV, go here, working. Later on, over the folding bath, I go into the sleeping room, check out if the kids are sleeping, the other kids still awake, and then go back and have my second beer. So at the end, I have a really long path I can go through, and this is something what makes this apartment very generous. The other thing is that there's almost no hierarchy anymore. The staircase is similar like the studying room, and the hall is also in a similar logic like the other rooms. So when you're inside, you don't feel that you're in this, you don't really feel where you are, because they have a similar quality. And the hall is interesting because from here you see in all directions. What makes it also like a very bright space. It's not dark at all. We will see later on pictures. This is how you see that all the apartments are different. How I said, depending on the constellation, but also depending on the high spaces in the corners. And we can also rotate the kitchen because it's a square. So when you rotate the kitchen, for example, on the apartment under the roof, we connect this space with the living room. So there's a lot of variety in the same, like in the same concept. We're not just believe in the plan and like the simulation of something. We're looking carefully in models about the spatial quality. And on one hand, we're focus on like the single space, the individual space, like you see all of them here, and also of the society of these rooms, how they interact or how they are connected with each other. This is a series of pictures I like to show, and they are all in the same apartment. So we're not changing pictures from other apartments, it's just the same. This one is the room. You see it goes up to under the roof with the long enfilade along the facade. Here could be, for example, an eating room where you go over the kitchen, for example, through the hall with the next room. Here is the hall where you have this like different direction and the light is coming from all four sides. And this is, for example, how you connect the two rooms around the corner room with this folding bath. Luke Scuyer come up in the 20s with it. It's a really fantastic way of connecting and closing rooms. This is a movie. There are like 4 sections through the building. Fabien and Karin Gauck and Fabien Schwarz did this movie for us. It gives an idea how this space is like changing.
Mm.
And you see always different view through this like a dense organism. Becomes kind of open, but how we detailed it, we always kept the chamber. So that's why, for example, all the doors have an architrave, that it's like something between an open plan and the chamber plan. From the outside, not much to say. They looks like the neighbors. They have a hipped roof with dormers, a socle, punctuated facade, like the one in the background. But the building is completely built or constructed in cement with a super cheap cement block, which is usually used for gardening in gardens for retaining walls. Here you just see, for example, how they build an architrave. And for us, I think we used a very cheap material to build this facade. And I think about construction, it's the question for us is not what you use it, what you use to build, but how you use it. And the corner of the building shows what you can construct just with this one block. The socle, here in the socle, the brick, the inside of the brick comes to the outside. The corner, the architrave, everything done with this one stone. The first series of projects, they are, let's say we call it, they're more developed on the plan. Later on, we will show some, they're more focused on the section. The one I'd like to share is a house for elderly people. It's called Helen Keller. And it's a competition. We did the second prize. And it's located in Schwamendingen. It's on the outskirts of Zurich. And you see you have a really heterogeneous context with small houses, with big houses. And the only thing who gets everything together is, in a way, the space in between them. And the brief for elderly housing mostly sounds quite boring, because these are just simply small units, mostly 2 or 2.5 room apartments. You know, you think on corridor or access balconies and so on. So yeah, was not so easy to start. But we did some, like not much time. We did quite a quick setting and decided just to place 2 buildings to maximize the outdoor space. And in each building you have 72 apartments. And the question suddenly starts to how can you organize such a dense or fat building? This diagram shows compares family housing or an apartment, a family apartment, with an apartment for elderly people. And family apartment normally has 4.5 rooms. An apartment for elderly people, 2.5 rooms. And the interesting thing is that in family housing, 4 rooms needs daylight. In elderly, in apartments for elderly people, 2 needs daylight, and 1 of them is the living, eating, entrance or cooking room. So it's a big room you can extend in the depth of the building. So here 25% of the rooms you can develop into the depth of the building, and here it's like 50%. So that means that when you do it, there's just a little left over also inside, in the inside of the building, where here it's blowing up. That means you can build a really dense, thick building. This is how we started to develop it, with a series of sketches. Started with a square and like fan out these different apartments. And you see the research is about the form of the building and the space, and of course the question of daylight. So we started here and ended here. So this plan shows the final structure. On this floor plan, there are 12 apartments. So with 12 apartments on 1 floor, that means each apartment only has an angle of 30 degrees. So this one here is just 30 degrees. And there's some rules that, for example, an apartment cannot be orientated towards north, northeast, and northwest. So that's why the facade is kind of oscillating. So when you, for example, are in this apartment, of course you have a direction towards the north, but you also have a direction to the west, even almost to the south. The apartment is then like fan out, getting open towards the facade, and it's like an array of always the same element with a rotated around. The inner is like a circulation where the elderly people also can meet, And at the end of this space, you always have a double high space for the washing rooms. This is what you see in the section, that there's also coming daylight into the depth of the building, and it creates a kind of continuous space through all the floors. This is a double high space from the washing room, and this is the fan-out apartment with a height of 2 meters and 8, and the building has a diameter of 45 meters, so it's a very efficient, dense building. What gives you a great overview on the outside, on the park around the buildings. So the building from the outside, they are like, let's say, a result of an inner logic of spatial structure. Housing, I think they have, they always relate on one hand on the program, like all kind of houses, always it's different if it's for elderly people, is it for families, or for example, is it for students? But also the context or the genius loc has a strong impact of a housing project. This one here, Houses at Dozen Views, is an apartment building in Zurich. You see a lot of detached townhouses here, and they create a small-scale urban fabric with different lushy vegetated outdoor spaces on this Adlisberg. Oh, sorry, that was the wrong one. I'm back. This one here is the plot, and when you're standing here, this yeah. Oh, sorry. Second. And that's the wrong one. This one is the plot. And when you're standing here, even it's so dense, you always get a view as in the certain, you get a view into these other gardens, and the view can be suddenly quite wide. You can see into these gardens, you see to the church, and thanks to slope, you also see over the city to the lake. The other thing is there are some rules who leads to a small envelope where the maximum length of a building is just 12 meters, and then you have to do a setback. So you cannot do like a simple shape or a simple rectangle shape. You can't get a fragmented envelope of a building. And to maximize the gross floor area, we also add like balconies and bay windows. So what you get is like kind of a living space or a fragmented building where you get a lot of views into the neighborhood. And instead of, let's say, having one big space, we get quite a diverse spatial figure, which is stretching and expanding and creating different small-scale spaces within this apartment. For example, here you get a small space for reading, for classic, sofa or the dining table or the kitchen. This is how it looks from the inside. For example, with the dining room, the eating room, with the kitchen and the view towards the city. Or here the living room with a ribbon window who opens up the space to the outside, but also give a certain privacy to the inhabitants. The house has a thin facade cladded in green metal, and the windows are hammered on the outside, so that at the inside you get a balustrade, and the skin looks really thin. So the building becomes like a pavilion in this garden. Now we kind of change to some projects. There may be more, the approach is more on a section than on a floor. This is the first project we built. It was a direct commission we got in 2009. And it's a holiday house. So it's just one room. It's maybe the smallest project we did. But maybe the smaller the project, the more freedom you get. This is the view to the Bernese Alps with the Lake Sarnen in the foreground. This picture we have taken showed the existing house and quite a steep slope here and some existing retaining walls. This house was destroyed in 2005 with a flood, and then you're allowed to replace the house because the house is standing outside the building area. So the shape of the building was in a way already given. The only thing we could change is the pitched roof to a tent roof. And we could kind of extend the retaining walls from the outside to the inside to create three levels. This one is an existing retaining wall we extend. This one is also an existing one we extend. And here we lifted up the build a small socle because of the high water. Das ist mir so Ich kann nicht machen.
Das Problem ist, du musst doch ändern, du nimmst den Highlighter, also den Leuchtschüssel, um es zu zeigen.
Ah, der Laser.
Oder den Stift,
okay.
Oder den Stift nimmst du einfach zum Malen.
And the project is elevations shows the relation between the roof and the topography. The tent roof is kind of floating over the topography and forms a strong horizon similar to the lake. This absolute plain surface where the topography is changed to. The facade actually is just a direct image in a way of a roof, the horizon of the roof, and the topography. The tent roof is quite an interesting architectonical element in the sense that it provides a space what is on one hand, it's a very high space. Here it's around 7 meters. And it's also a very wide space because of the horizon. It also opens the space towards the surrounding, but it also encloses it because of the huge roof. The supports of the house are inside the building, so that the facade is completely open, and the scenery becomes omnipresent inside the room. The retaining walls, how I said, they create these like 3 terraces. Here you have one for sleeping, one for living, and one for cooking and eating. And only the facade, who's all around, is separating the inside from the outside. Show you 4 elevations. I hope it works with the speed. No. And this project is just one room. And the interesting thing about having one room is that everything is visible and strongly present simultaneously. The topography, the roof, the facade, the columns, and of course the surrounding nature and climate, because there is no partition. It's one key aspect for us was how to deal with the column and the roof, and because the roof is in a way like a flat surface, and the column is something linear, and the idea was to that the roof we separate also in a linear structure with prefab infills here. So the column and the roof becomes quite a strong entity, and are not two different parts anymore. I will go through quite quick through these construction details. I think it gets clear when you see the construction site. This is how we built the column, these Y-shaped columns. And this one shows with these prefab elements and these upstanding beams, so we can save quite a lot of the form work because we already had these prefab elements. But yet from the outside, the building, you see the entire structure of the roof and the large forces. And we didn't like so much this view, so we just simply clad it with thin Cooper cladding. So the house kind of holds a secret you never see. You don't see the, let's say, the power or the amount of work in this roof. And from a distance, the house with this dark Cooper tent roof and the white socle and the dark facade becomes a part of the vernacular scenery in a natural way, looking as if it's there for years. The heavy inner structure is transformed in a light paper thin appearance by the thin eaves. And the only element where the loads of the supporting structure is visible are the two columns. The sculpture power of the column transform to a thin paper-like eave. This is from the sleeping area, where the lake reaches the house, and it always change when you're inside the house, it change a lot the relation from the roof and the landscape. Here on the living room, where the sea is very present, and on the eating area, your head is inside the roof space and you don't see the shore of the lake anymore. The house is for rent, and the tenant is a collective object, and the huge space absorbs all the objects. And I think this picture shows how different you can live in a huge space. I think we never imagine that someone will live like this, but I think it fits quite well. Now the scale of the project is getting bigger again. It's a small, it's a single family house, house on a slope. In Switzerland, it's not flat, so we always have to deal with the question of the topography. Here, the topography is very steep, how you see on the image, and the site is located at the bottom of a valley. Here's the river Berzaska. So, because the building is on one hand, it's at the slope, but at the bottom. So the question is not about the view. So that's why we could place the living room on the ground floor and the private rooms on the first floor. The diagram shows the relation between the inclination and the different circulation types. So to walk comfortable in a house, you have a steepness of 17 to 29. But the slope has steepness of 35 degrees, so it's not possible, for example, to have a cascade. So that's why we kind of organized the plan like a serpentine. So the house is basically a path. It's like a path you take when you walk up a mountain. Who goes up like this. So you walk, for example, here from the library, you walk up through the living room, eating room, kitchen, entrance, and then you go up to the sleeping rooms. The long retaining walls leads one room into another. The rooms are getting wide and they're getting close again. So the space is kind of breathing, getting dense and wide. And the view is always along the walls and the light as well. The space towards the Verzaska, here's the river, are getting higher and higher, so that the library is at the end around 6.5 meters. The top floor looks exactly the same like the ground floor. The concrete structure is absolutely equal. There is no structural break between ground floor and the top floor. The only element that is added are some, for some privacy, are steel closets you see here. But the spatial principle is exactly the same. And I think it's something quite unique that a living room or a structure for a living room can work the same like a structure for individual rooms. In that sense, the house becomes a strong entity. You see the section, how the house is like embedded in this topography. And we build it just purely in concrete. So it's there aren't any dilatation joints between the floor and the wall, and it's in a way a very pure way of a space, almost like an archaic space. The spaces are then kind of intimate and generous at the same time, powerful cast in concrete and gentle shaped by light. You see here the view from the library towards the living room, from the living room to the eating room, from the eating to the kitchen, on the upper floors between the walls and the closets. And how you recognize each space on the ground floor has its own terrace. So the terrace is in a way the only thing who gets who relates in a way to the inner structure of the building. The house, in a way, it's kind of full of contrasts, but also in a harmony with its surroundings. What is the old town of Gordola? There's another house on a slope too, this one here, because the client, we had problems to get, difficulties to get the permission for this house. So he bought a plot 40 meters above. And they are in a way completely different, but also both dealing with the topography. This one is at the bottom of the valley, and this is in a way at the edge. And here the living room is on top, and where it's all about the view. You show the view here, you see it, it's a fantastic panorama to the Lago Maggiore and the Magodino Ebene. And this plot is really steep. You see it here, it's almost 45 degrees. And this guy here, I think he misunderstood the project House on a Slope 1, because actually you go up like this. So when you build on a steep slope, mostly it's all about the view and no one cares about the slope. But for us was important that the slope and the view is in a balance. So in this corporal space, you have on one hand, you have the view, and on the other hand, you see or you still feel the steep topography. And the building is, let's say at the end of the day, it's just a cross section following here on the natural terrain, here on the guidelines from the building law, and it needs a spatial idea of living. The building is also built in concrete, isolated on the outside and plastered with sanded bitumen membranes. Now we go a little bit further. The scale is getting bigger again. It's actually our latest project we did was a competition we lost a few months ago. And it's the context of the settlement. Großalbis is a garden city on a gentle slope based on the master plan from Heinrich Peter from the 30s. You see here this garden city. It's also in Zurich, and here's the lake of Zurich. And the task was to replace these 6 building blocks here in order to double the GFA. The predominant building typology is the row house with kitchen gardens and providing high quality living in the outskirts of the city. And the goal for us was to transfer these ideas of the garden city into the present and keep these qualities. So the new sentiment actually strictly follows the master plan from Heinrich Peter, just doubling the GFA. So with this urbanistic approach, the footprint, the building shape, and the typology is already set. Nothing to think about anymore. So the question is of the densification can only be answered in a section. So we stacked 3 different type of apartments on top of each other, each one with its unique spatial quality depending on the position in the cross section. So you have a garden duplex which is strongly related to the slope, providing a 4-meter high space. This apartment is for families. Then there's the roof duplex, who deals with the vertical space from the roof and provides like a generous room for eating and cooking. And in between, there are the smaller apartments for elderly people, couples, or single. And this space is completely horizontal. This type, the whole settlement, it's just this cross section extruded. The garden duplex, how you see, is open. It's living room towards the private garden. The apartment for elderly or singles has an informal space orientated towards the access balcony, which can be used as a studio, a bar, a library, or an exhibition space. And this is the roof duplex with a kitchen and an eating area. So this is, let's say, the last project. It's the biggest one. So I think it needs some time to get through. That's why I was quite quick with the others. Houses, fireplaces, and halls. We just finished it in 2020. And there are some quite relevant aspects in this project, or to understand the project. On one hand, we have quite a big street here, who goes down from the Bouquetplatz to the Hartbrücke. And this street is, I think it's the busiest street in Zurich, where 58,000 cars pass by every day. So the question of noise has a strong impact of the typology of the house. Then the other thing what is relevant is that also here you have a slope in this direction, and also a slope towards the Rosengartenstrasse. It's placed in the city of Zurich, and the brief also asks for having a park in this area here. So to concentrate the whole program along the street. And what is the program is for student housing, and the student housing is quite interesting because they live in like Wohngemeinschaften. So they live like 7 students share a house. So you have a lot of single rooms you have 7 rooms, for example, and just 1 living room. So the question on one hand is, how can you organize so many individual rooms in an apartment and avoid corridors? The other question is, you see the diagram from the government shows here. On this hand, on the street, along the facade, it's very noisy. It's over 85 decibel. So all rooms has to get ventilated towards the quiet side. So most architects, they start to create or to increase the envelope of a building by proposing a COM structure. But the problem in an urbanistic sense of a COM structure is that the private building and the public space getting like overlapping, and it's not clear anymore where is private and where is public. So we really like to avoid a building with a COM structure. This diagram shows 3 like different layouts of organizing the individual rooms. This one is from the COM structure we just took over. So you have a long corridor here and the living room here. Everything is ventilated towards the park. Yeah, we don't want to build a COM structure, so let's forget it. And the other one is that you have, for example, just a linear array of the individual rooms, but then you get a very long, for example, living room. What it becomes almost a corridor. So we thought we just stacked these rooms on top of each other, so you don't get a corridor, and here you get the double high space. And then the other thing is was that we switched this individual room towards the street to ventilate it towards the park. So you get a second double high space here. I think here it's getting more clear. All these rooms are ventilated towards the park, and the living and kitchen area here is also ventilated towards the park. So we have a kind of a maisonette type, and we just stacked 2 on top of each other. This one goes under the roof, and the upper one here with the pitched roof, we did not only, let's say, because we like the roof as a shape, but the interesting thing for us is that you have exactly the same spatial structure like by this apartment here. So there's no change in the floor plan. The only thing what is changing is the section. And another aspect, it's maybe detail, but you can also ventilate rooms who are located on the street over the roof to the park. So this is in a way the plan. You see it's just simply an array of the same apartment. Here you have the double high space from the living room, and here's the double high space from the loggia. All the individual rooms are along the park. So the plan is in a way quite rigid with a grid, depending on the size of a room, but gets high variety in the section. For example, you have the double high space from the loggia here, and here double high space under the roof. You get rooms with dormers. You get classical rooms. So the variety is just in the stacking and the counterline of the building. Here the section shows the addition of each apartment, how it's following along the street and along the topography. This is the student room. They're around 14 square meter, and they are like quite a private room where the students can study. They all meet in the hall, but it's a huge place where they can study together, cook together, eat and discuss together. You see how the hall is related to the double high loggia with the chimney. This loggia, I think it's in a way the key of this project, because it's the lung of the building, because all rooms, the living room, the kitchen, and also some private rooms are ventilated towards the park through this loggia. And the loggia is also connecting two student apartments with each other. So the students share this space together. The apartment under the roof changed quite in quality. The space are getting vertical, how you see here with the dormer. The size of the room is exactly the same, but along the facade, the room is getting low and high under the ridge. This is quite a spectacular room. The split on the right-hand side is just to ventilate this room towards the park. This is the apartment under the roof, where the space getting higher than 9 meters. The interesting thing on having a noise condition is that you always have a lack of program on the street side. So that's why it makes it possible to get these huge spaces. We built it quite rough. The primary structure is in concrete, and the door, the stair, the wardrobe, and so on are just added autonomous elements. So the concrete structures kind of orchestrate all these elements. The linear building follows precisely the terrain and the street, and the small unit of the duplex apartment is recognized in the building. And the building kind of oscillating between a small scale of a townhouse and a large scale building. And all the living halls, kitchen, student rooms, and entrances are orientated to the street. So this facade becomes full of life. On the other side is the park. The building is very concentrated to maximize the space for the park. Here you recognize the loggias and the chimneys. This is a picture we just took a few weeks ago. And you see that this large hall is not used just for living. Because of the Corona pandemic, the students change the living room into a studio. Obviously with Walter Gropius, these are architecture students. And we hope that soon they can go back to the university and finally have a party in this room. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Christian. An extraordinary body of work. Before I call on Nima to speak to you, I want to say that I've gotten many positive text messages already. The best one, which says, "When I grow up, I want to become Swiss," which I believe is a testament to the quality of your work. One small comment about your work, possibly a question, and that is that in your poised cadence, the way that you present your work, there seems to be absolutely no anxiety between the vernacular, the traditional, and the modern legacy of the 20th century. They are all somehow seamlessly bound with each other. And I'm trying to understand some of the cultural differences at work between Switzerland and the US or other places in the world right now, and where you position your work. Are you battling the externalities of constraints, cultural and otherwise, and this is that's its imprint on your work? Or actually, is your work a testament to an ideological bias that you already have in helping to mediate these different forces as a positive aspect of your work?
I think it's more the latter, if you could say. Somehow, I mean, let's say, on one hand, you can probably also say that we sort of address this question constantly, and we would probably not like finally say like what the position precisely would be. Well, I think it's sort of a work in progress, but still, I think since there's so many things addressing sort of a task we are working on, I think so. Of course, you somehow try to address all these things. Let's say, and let's say I felt it was quite interesting to hear that you sort of feel like we have a certain freedom of also like taking like vernacular elements, let's say, and stuff like that. And maybe also when you notice how we explain a project, it also maybe only not does just sound like the exterior is sort of a result of the interior. It somehow quite often sort of also is, let's say. And maybe you also, during the introduction, I felt like you also addressed this idea of having this mediation, or let's say this discussion between the outside and the inside, let's say. And sometimes we also get approached by we almost get like insults in terms of like people cannot really relate like the exterior to the interior, stuff like that. But it's sort of, I think since maybe also like the outside of a house is also sort of this edge between an inner logic and, let's say, the results of needs of a client, and like maybe the exterior is much more like immediately addressing like the exterior components addressed by the city or by the laws and stuff. It could sometimes also happen that these things sort of, there's this grinding between those, that sometimes it even feels like this sort of I think maybe, I don't know if you can compare it to when Rem Koolhaas talks about lobotomy, where you have like it's almost like a separation between, let's say, the skin of a house and some sort of an inner logic. But sometimes it also, it has the feeling that maybe it also addresses things like that somehow, like this points like that, or aspects.
I'm going to hand over the mic to Nima, who I know wants to share some images as a precondition to some of his questions. But while I do that, I'm going to ask others to go ahead and post questions in the chat room, and we can tap into those freely also. So with that, Nima, why don't you take it over?
Yes. So thank you so much for the lovely presentation. And we are very excited to have you guys for our workshops for the housing studio. And there was something that immediately we loved about your work when Nader, I think a few months ago, shared your work with me. And so my questions are kind of trying to understand something about our own interest in your own work. Plus, we also, you also shared a workbook with us, which was very lovely. And some of the things that I'm showing is basically your work, and some of it might be, you know, it's kind of zoom into your method of working from a distance that we look at. And in case it's very personal, you can ask me to stop sharing. But so the questions are essentially about two things. One is about they're very specific. One is about drawing, the other is about the way you, modes of rotation as a geometric act. And not only the differences that it produces in your work, but also as a commonality of a technique. The drawing question is about these construction drawings that are not only graphically lovely, and also I personally like construction drawings for the architecture of the drawing itself. But I thought maybe there's also a statement there about both in this case, which is a spatially rich house, and also the way it's been put together. But since you guys are, seems from your work, it seems to be, you're very careful about the way it seems, the decisions on tectonic and construction are very deliberate. So, you know, I was wondering if there's a statement about continuity of the, because generally construction drawings are something in between trades and architects, and are not shared in the workbooks and portfolios, but you guys so powerfully put it in your portfolio and your workbook. There was a statement there, less on this than it was on these ones, which were kind of what I loved about them. They were construction as it comes. It's you know, standard materials. There's no aura around materiality. There are things as well. They're not necessarily, you mentioned, you know, affordable or cheapness. It might be true, but it's also something about construction as we understand if we go to construction shows. And you present it that way, which I thought was very powerful. And you put it next to a very conceptual plan. So there was something that I thought there is even a deliberate decision. Maybe there's not a statement there, but there is an intentionality there that is rich. And then it's about rotation. And I know there are these three plans that rotation is doing something very different. In one, the envelope remains constant, and the ingredients of the services are changing, and they're creating a whole range of new relationship between the rooms. And the other ones where the envelope is also being affected by the rotation. And the last one, which you had a radial, system operating. And there's this theme of rotation in your work, and it's producing different spatialities and conditions. But I thought it's important to point out that the way you rotate is almost there's a consistent element in the way you rotate. And to prove that, I thought we can compare your work with another kind of architect of close to your region architect, that Hans Sharoon, and how he uses rotation in plan to produce different spatiality. And my point is not actually the similarity of Helen Keller's senior housing and the Romeo and Juliet housing project of Sharoon, but it's actually the difference in the way you rotate and you work with this idea of oblique. In his case, it seems that both of you are producing different kinds of oblique connections within the unit, but also creating vistas and orientations that vary through the plan towards outside. But if we compare to the kind of local moments, we understand that in his case, in Sharon's case on the right, generally the party walls or the walls between the units, the ingredients of the units are falling in between. They follow a hybrid, they split the angular difference. So we have partitions that are almost dividing the difference between, we have this that is neither following that or that. But in your case, it's very powerful and ruthless in a binary expression that this belongs to that, this belongs to this. And it's almost as if the units are almost overlapping the below unit, and things are not. So there is a kind of rawness in that operation, which I thought is quite interesting. And it may also explain from what I am showing here, that why Nader and I, as Iranians, in the best moment of Iranian architecture, we see this kind of ruthless overlap of rotation of the whole building, not necessarily a courtyard, but in Isfahan, where there is a clear overlap that one building kind of overlaps and obliterates the building below, which I think produces not only it's something that is rather unique in the context, and it may sound, most historic cities, they have intermediary fabric that blends the two conditions. Here is a bit abrupt, and it creates kind of abrupt spatiality as well, where you see something frontal and then you see the same building in the oblique condition, which is rich. And I want to point out that that kind of operation you also mentioned in your work, but it also produces something double read in this work, which at one level that you explained, we can see a building with a gabled roof that in a very elegant way, the topography is subtracted and you're not touching the topography. But at the same time, you produce this elegant drawing that shows the 45 or 42 is very similar. And it's essentially, we can read this as a flat roof building that has been rotated on the top to lean on the landscape. And it's a full rotation of the whole building, and it's never elemental. It's a full, and it produces this double read of iconography where a building can be read both as a gabled roof that is buried in the landscape, and at the same time, a kind of flat roof building that is leaning on the landscape. So the consequences of that simple operation sometimes can create double reads of iconography, which I thought was quite rich. So this was a warm-up question for other people to join, but it's also something that I thought it's a technique that you...
It's almost hard to, where would you start? There were so many, let's say, probably if I would I think rotation was probably the word noted the most. So I will probably address this first, let's say. To be honest, I did not notice in advance that the rotation was so important. Almost to that extent that I now believe it myself. But what I felt was funny is, for example, we have this website. We actually hesitated quite a while to do a website because we felt we don't have the time to do it because we would rather work on stuff. But then all of a sudden we had this idea where you would have a lot of different plans, images and stuff. And whenever you would enter the homepage, you would always have a different constellation, and you would get adjacencies where you would all of a sudden note some similarities or like subjects that were addressed in one project and in another one. that you see like that there's some themes, let's say, that maybe sometimes they swing from one to a next one, or they get lost somewhere and then there's another one coming. So that's something, in that sense, of course, I think there is, as you did, for example, yourself, by just putting these 3 projects besides each other, all of a sudden you almost sort of, I don't know, yeah, I mean, you make this point of the rotation being so important. I'm not so sure if it really is, but what definitely is quite interests us a lot is that, like, that there is probably a certain, no, of course not probably, there is a certain inner logic to probably, I mean, to all projects themselves. And sometimes it's like there's this sort of force that links these things together, and sometimes the outside is like just what's happening as a result, or maybe sometimes we sort of give us a restraint to a really rigid outside, and there's something in between, and there's this constant struggle between those things. And it's, for example, the way how you work on things, sometimes maybe, I don't know, of course, you probably try to find out certain rules, how to think about certain things that you initially have, like we sort of believe in the strong idea, and the rules to, like, we sort of try to imply, maybe, let's say, rules to sort of address this initial idea to get a spatial quality out of it, and there's rules to it, let's say.
But what I liked, like the examples you showed, at the end of the day, I think, for example, Sharon has similar questions like we have, just to be honest. Let's say when you have a really fat building, the question is about the light, the view, directions. You know, when you have a punctual building with a lot of it, you have 4 facades. Of course, there is coming a rotation depending on the situation you have, on the light you have. So projects are dealing with same questions. That's why I think you figure out a certain similarity. I think you find it by other topics as well. It also sometimes happens, let's say you design or you draw a competition. At the end you figure out, okay, these guys, they do it a quite similar way like you did it, because same questions at the end of the day, similar questions.
That's true. But I was pointing more towards the differences of technique, which I think is profound between you and Sharon, while there are, you know, commonality of setup, as you mentioned, which I think is quite great. I think there is one question, there is one question about the influences. I think Miguel Falchi is asking if you can talk about the influences in, I think Miguel is seeing some Shinohara there, and because of the existence of column, there is also some Olgiati. Do you agree with that? And where does it? Yes. So, do you see that as influences? Because you also, I think, from the way you explained that you've worked for Christian Kerez, but do you see any connection between your work and Olgiati and through Olgiati towards Shinohara or not?
I think the connection, the closest connection we have is to Christian Kerez. Like, let's say we worked in his office for more than 5 years. I also taught at his chair. And I think what is amazing is this kind of openness in the way he thinks about something. And of course, to looking for quite a strong idea. I think the others, let's say, if we have, of course, there are projects we like, and the topic we like, for example, the house with 2 columns, I think it's also, for example, quite close to Utzon, because it's a question of the topography and the roof, the floating roof, about topography. And I think at the end of the day, there are like several topics or aspects you always think in your work. And at the end of the day, it's about, I think in our work, it's about the spatial, about the space or the quality of a space. So for example, the house with 2 columns, for us, it was clear that the columns are in the center of the building, so that the facade is completely open and to has as less columns as possible, that the space becomes really open. So I think you start on with a spatial idea. And I think this is what all these projects have. For example, the house on a slope is an idea of how you can walk or move inside an apartment or in a house. And the idea is not as an abstract thing. It's not like a mind game. It's something what is always strongly related to the genius loci. I think this is all of them. I think the genius loci has a very strong impact because it describes the topography, the climate, the law, the noise, everything. And we always ask, for example, when we are doing housing, is how is it to live on Zwyssigstrasse number 14? What is the character of this apartment on to living exactly at this place in the world, that it becomes in a way super specific. And I think it's not only the program who makes something specific. I think it's especially also the place where you build it. How is it there? Is it dense? How's the nature? How is the noise, and so on?
And maybe you mentioned Shinohara. Let's say there's definitely something that I like the first times when I got in sort of contact with his architecture, that was quite striking and probably still sort of is in my head today, and which I still think has a strong, quite some power, is that he always, I mean, he sort of addressed the idea of within the constraints of like it's not a big, he usually didn't work on big scale tasks, but he still always addressed like a certain generosity within plans, within sections, like, so at the end, it's like the spatial generosity he managed to sort of find within his projects. I also like to have these adjacencies of maybe sometimes super tiny individual rooms, and then all of a sudden you would also have like something that breaks this scale. This is probably definitely something that would interest us a lot looking at Shinohara.
There is one question also from my colleague Merciha, who we would be having more conversation during our housing studio. And she loves your work, but she's also asking if you want to explain how you balance between when it comes to the projects, how you balance between the conceptual and geometric risks or the ambitions of the project, and at the same time how you manage it, to deal with housing projects where efficiency, affordability, and are also factors to consider. And I think along that there's also my first question about how you deal with normative building methods in an expressive way.
I think there's a lot of naivety. No, can you say if you're naive?
It sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. So you sort of always, I mean, we have this naive idea of, I mean, every project is another chance to find something, to maybe get rid of constraints, to maybe to turn constraints into qualities, stuff like that. It sounds quite maybe a bit simple-minded, let's say, but we always see quite a potential in super banal settings, let's say.
But I think what is always a catalyst of an idea, I think, is when you have when formwork is quite difficult. The framework. I think you need something you have to deal with.
Friction. We need friction.
Yes.
It's,
Well, I really
there was a-
appreciated
Go
the
ahead,
first
sorry.
project where you showed the rooms and the algorithm that you had designed for them. It seemed that the access to light was really the secret to that friction, in terms of finding which rooms could be kind of clustered and then which could be actually moved throughout. So I think for our students, we're in the middle of the housing studio, and just, you know, understanding the basics is so difficult, but within them, there's such a magic in terms of finding ways to bring out those design risks. So I was just curious to know, like, where those, as you said, frictions often come out. You know, it seems that in the very first project, access to light was the main animator for how you were able to redistribute the rooms in a more spatially innovative way.
I think, yeah, I think it was more like access to views, which leads to light, let's say.
Right.
It's sort of related.
And
There are other questions. I think both Daisy and Mokena have thoughts also. Maybe they can just chime in themselves.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation today. I think one thing that I was particularly struck by was, and I think Nader mentioned this, is kind of the pace and control in which you talk about your project. It gave us time to kind of read as you presented, and it was so meticulous and thoughtful, and I really appreciated that. And so what I appreciated most in your presentation was when the kind of thoughtfulness and care, especially when it's articulated in a kind of like metric or data and a diagram, and then you kind of present the work and it's a little bit more whimsical. And so where those two things meet, and I think that's a kind of common theme from the conversation thus far, where those two things meet, I find particularly interesting. And I'm curious how, as architects, you make those negotiations and you accommodate both. At least that's my reading, is that all these projects kind of have both. They have the kind of data statistical moment, and then they also have the kind of whimsical, kind of spatial, experiential component that I think come together really nicely. So I'm wondering how those two things for you both are kind of negotiated.
Well, let's, for example, during the lecture, you've seen some illustrations that show some super basic, let's say, settings of the task. And you should really take care. It's not what was there in the beginning, because what's really interesting, let's say that usually what's a big chance to do a lecture, even though Christian did it, I usually don't. No, actually, I never actually, he's always doing it. But the thing is, it gives you a chance. You have to reflect on things in order to give it further to people listening to you, right? So in that sense, this reflection sort of clarifies a lot. And the more clarified it is, the more precise you can almost put it into a diagram or like a basic scheme or drawing and whatsoever. So in that sense, I just want to point out that sometimes these things can also just come up in the end, to realize why you would go up in the house on a slope, like in a serpentine instead as in this cascade, because it's just simply a problem of inclination. And yeah, I don't know.
Okay. Just to follow up again, thank you for a really great presentation. Really enjoyed the architecture, the operation, and the inventiveness, both spatially and structurally. I'm just curious because housing is one of those sort of spaces in architecture where there's a dance, if you will. So there's the architect, there's the architecture itself, and the client, and one could argue that somehow between these sort of three actors, some amazing things happen. So I'm just curious to hear about the client or the user in these projects and processes, the extent to which they were engaged, the extent to which that engagement began to influence the design, or was there a high degree of trust in which you were able to pursue these ideas with some degree of autonomy? I think it'd be very useful for the students to understand about the impact of let's call it third-party actors on the creativity of the architect. And I think the point about naivety is very, very powerful, because in some instances one would find clients resisting that naivety or looking for reassurance, both in the process as well as the product. So just keen to hear about how do you engage with clients in terms of the dance of architecture?
I think it's always different. Like the bigger housing projects, they're all competitions we won. So the competition is like you just do what you want, and the client take it or leave it. So you get in a quite a strong position winning a competition. Even when it's a public competition, you're in a super strong position because it was chosen by a jury because it was the best project. And so you always can go back to this point. And the client is also doing like a commitment in a way he has chosen your work. So then you can like go forward on this step. I think with private clients is a different thing. There you don't enter with a proposal. There it can be also more like a discussion and something you develop together. They have certain dreams you take off, you take or you change. But I think what is important in the project is of course, on one hand is the client with a certain trust. On the other hand is also the people like you work together. For example, with all the projects we work together with Mario Monotti, the engineer. And with him, for example, we have a very close discussion about how to build these houses. Because let's say the competition is just it's a Behauptung. It's something you have to prove in the next years. And for this, I think it's important to have people you can discuss aspects of building and constructing, who are open to rethink the way you can build.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Sorry, go ahead. Were gonna add some more? Please go ahead.
No.
Yeah, because I was actually remarking in a side chat with Haley. I was talking about your projects. I found them quite structural and structurally ordered. So although there's an operation and a degree of whimsy, you can definitely see the sort of structural logic as a sort of driver of opportunity, if you will. And I think that's also a good thing for students to understand, that sort of interplay between space and structure and space, and understanding that, when you begin to unlock structure, that it allows you to be really quite inventive, that structure is not a passive part of a design process, but rather an active part of the process. And it sounds like your structural engineer is a partner on a number of projects with you, learning with you and developing a rapport. Is that correct?
Yeah, he was involved in all projects.
Okay. No, that's
very strong like relation.
It's super important. Yeah. Yeah. In my experience, you need those collaborators who they get your drawing and they know what you're drawing. They don't call over and over again and say, "What are you trying to do?" Yeah.
And I think it's just important to just be open to everything. And I think it helps always to change your point of view. Yeah, and let's say like architecture is such an old field. There was built thousands of houses. So we all deal with the same elements. The Rem Koolhaas show at the Biennale. So we think about this again and again. And I think it's important to change your point of view, and this change, and you need someone who is also changing and helping them to develop things from another way.
Fantastic. Look, we have the pleasure of having you with the students, and we're really, really grateful for that. But I'd like to ask the both of you to kind of rewind to when you were students, and what would you have wished that your professors had said to you whilst you were studying? Like, what is the one thing that you wish that you had heard many years ago?
What do you mean in terms of what we missed hearing, or what we?
Anything. Be free, be whimsical, be purposeful. I mean, you've amassed a lot of knowledge post your studies, and it's apparent in your work. And I'm just wondering if there's any message that you'd like to impart to students that you wish that you had heard when you were studying, or was your education a seamless and perfect journey?
I know what. Very important. Kill your darling.
Yes. Stephen King. I like
it's a daily business, really. Kill it.
Yeah, no, that's a good message.
All, and
it's about as good a message as you can end a wonderful 2 hours on. I'm mindful of everybody's schedule and time and other classes that they have to run to. But I'm also very grateful to the two of you for making yourselves available for the extended workshops. And I do want to thank again the Swiss consulate for making this particular event possible. So with that, thank you very much to the two of you and to everyone else who's been with us over the past couple of hours. And I look forward to seeing all of you very soon. Over and out. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.